I'm Josh Schneider-Weiler, coming up on Football Today. In July of 2016, Wolves were an average championship side with a lame duck manager. Then, the fortunes of the club changed overnight.
Good evening. New season, new owners. Wolverhampton Wanderers has been sold for around £45 million to a Chinese conglomerate. Shanghai-based Fosun International have bought the club off Steve Morgan, who's been in charge since 2007. Wolves have had a difficult...
Since then, Wolves have been on a rapid rise to the top of English football.
Meanwhile, for Wolves, put some level on points now with Manchester United in 5th place. Stevie, they're looking good, aren't they?
I'll tell you what, they've got some weapons. I mean, they've got a bit of everything. You know, you've got the, Traore.
Last season, the club narrowly missed out on Champions League football, and this year, they're expected to make another run at the lucrative competition. Today, we analyze their recent signings and look at the growing influence of superagents and networks in football.
It's been a pretty good window.
Joe Edwards covers Wolves for the Express and Star and is a co-host of the E&amp Wolves podcast.
Obviously made 3 signings, Fabio Silva, Fernando Marçal and Vitinha from Porto. I think they've given themselves a good cushion. I think there's one position that they kind of need to sort still, and that's the right wing back area. Following the sale of Matt Doherty to Tottenham, that is an area that does need addressing. They've got a couple of weeks to get that done, and the aim will be to get that done. But for now, they've got a few signings in. They've started off the season with a win as well, a very good win at Sheffield United. So, and Nuno has signed a new contract as well, which is, in many eyes, the signing of the summer. So there's a lot to be happy about, but equally, still a bit of work to do yet.
If we look at some of these deals, they seem to have super agent Jorge Mendes' fingerprints all over them. How much influence do you think he has on these deals?
You can kind of see for yourself, can't you, that obviously it's a relationship that has kind of flourished really over the last few years. They've made a lot of kind of signings with Mendes links, and pretty much, you'd say 90% of them have been successes, most notably Ruben Neves.
Goes whipped to the edge of the 6-yard box. It was just over the top of Bolly. Comes out to Neves. Flicks it up. It's on the volley. Oh! Ruben Neves! Ruben Neves with one of the greatest goals you will ever see. That is
Diogo Jota.
Jota trying to drive his way forward, and he's bundled his way into the box here. Diogo Jota! Diogo Jota may just have scored the goal that takes Wolves to an FA Cup semi-final.
Daniel Powdence in January, who's looking like a very good player now as well. So it's a kind of a contact and a relationship that they can tap into, and it's worked. And it might seem a bit unusual to people who aren't Wolves fans or are fans of different clubs, but from a Wolves perspective and from a fan perspective, they're more than happy to see it, because the success rate of the players so far that have come in has been fantastic, really. And as long as that continues, then everybody will be happy.
I was listening to your podcast last week, and your co-host, Nathan Judah, kind of made a joke that Mendes was involved in 99% of Wolves' transfers. Do you think he kind of has too much influence over their transfer activity?
I think that's open for debate, I guess. I mean, as I say there, he does have an influence, of course. And, you look at Fabio Silva coming in, it's not directly his client, but he's played a part in brokering that deal. Vitinha, who's come in this window, is a client of Mendes as well. But the kind of the success rate is just something that you've got to look at. I mean, had these players been coming in and not been cutting it and not been up to the standard, then I think a lot more people would be kind of turning their noses up at it. But the success speaks for itself. They've brought players in through Mendes and Raul Jimenez and again Neves, Jota, they've all had an impact on this team, and they've all played a big part in getting to Wolves to where they are now, which is a real force in the Premier League. Wolves aren't the only club that have got a big link with an agent, but it's something that has worked, and until the approach doesn't work and the signings that coming on up to standard, then I don't see any reason why they're going to change their approach.
I want to dig into some of these signings. Fabio Silva specifically went for £35 million, which is a huge fee for a newly turned 18-year-old and someone who hasn't played more than 200 senior league minutes, which is pretty unprecedented. In fact, he's actually the third most expensive 18-year-old ever. I'm just curious, had you heard of him before this deal? And did that fee surprise you?
Had I heard of him? Not really, but that goes for the majority of signings that Wolves have made during the Fawcett era. I mean, I'd be lying to you if I said I knew a lot about Ruben Neves, a lot about Raul Jimenez, a lot about Diogo Jota. None of the players really that have come in have been household names, but they've all gone on to do very well. Silva, it's a lot of money. There's no getting away from it. It is a lot of money for an 18-year-old, but I think when you delve into it, you can see the reasoning from Wolves' side, because they have got an established star striker in Raul Jimenez, who is very much the main man, the number 9 who scores all the goals. They tried to bring in a competitor for his place last summer in Patrick Cutrone. Didn't really work. The fans took to him, but he never really took to life in England. He's now back in Italy. That was a kind of a 16 million, 18 million ballpark kind of signing, managed to make their money back on that. But in Silva, it's a lot of money initially, but it's an 18-year-old who has the potential to learn off Jimenez, who truly at the moment is one of the best strikers around, and perhaps then be Wolves' striker for years to come. Maybe take over from Jimenez and then be the main man himself. So it's a lot of money, and there is no hiding that. But equally, at the same time, this could be a real kind of long-term investment for Wolves. And, the sell-on value could be huge as well.
Before we go more into Silva, something I found interesting about that was how the fee was kind of portioned. And not all of the money went to Porto. Can you kind of explain where all of the money went in this deal?
So, Porto kind of put an update out on the Portuguese kind of stock commission, which is something quite normal for Portuguese clubs to do. They kind of outline sales that they make. And so it was a 35 million fee, and according to them, £9 million of that went to agents. So Mendes, as we say, not directly Silva's agents, pocketed he's set to receive around £6 million from that deal. And STV, Soccer Talents Vision, who is the agency that actually represents Silva, stand to receive around £3 million. So again, it's something that really kind of catches your eye, because, especially from a Wolves perspective, because it's a big money deal and agents receiving such a cut is not something that you see every day. But again, in the wider footballing world, it is something that happens a fair amount. But when it's an 18-year-old and it's £35 million, of course, eyes get drawn to it. But it kind of goes back to the root of it all. If he turns out to be a successful Wolves and scores the goals that they hope that he will, and turns out to be the player that they think he could be, then I don't think anybody really, at least from a fan's perspective, is going to bat an eyelid.
Now, there have been some whispers online because of Porto's issues with financial fair play recently, and with their relationship with Mendes, and of course Mendes' relationship with Wolves, that this fee might be a little bit inflated to kind of help out Porto, and that Wolves might have kind of done them a favor. Do you get that feeling as well, or is that just pure internet maybe speculation and reading between the lines?
You can read a lot of things, can't you, on the internet? I can get the argument for that, but equally, as I say, Wolves shelled out 16 million for Patrick Cutrone, and it just didn't work. Here, that they're getting somebody who can actually be under the learning tree of Jimenez and hopefully take on that mantle for himself. He could be Wolves' main striker for 4 or 5 years and then go on to great things. I think one thing that they will have looked at with the Fabio Silva deal is the talk of him having a €125 million release clause. Now, we saw João Felix go to Atletico Madrid for absolutely insane money. It was, I think it's about £113 million that it rises to after a breakthrough season at Benfica, a player of a similar age, of a similar kind of profile in youth football. So if Wolves perhaps didn't go in for Silva this summer, and that according to them, he's the player that they've always kind of looked at in that age group and singled him out as kind of the standout striker of that age group. If they would have waited another year, then maybe we wouldn't be talking about £35 million. Maybe we could be talking somewhere a lot closer to that €125 million release clause. So while it is a lot of money, and there is an argument perhaps that it is an inflated fee, Wolves will be hoping that they've got ahead of the curve, really, because if this player, Silva, I don't know a great deal about him yet, hopefully we'll see him play soon, has the potential to be a superstar. So Wolves will be hoping that's the case, and that it will be money well spent.
What we look at is the talent of the player, the quality of the player, and the ability and capacity that the player has to come and adapt as fast as possible to our idea, to our squad, and to our environment. And we are really happy with Fabio.
We haven't seen him play too much, and I mean, let's be honest, he hasn't played many minutes of senior football, but there have been a lot of comparisons to Raul Jimenez. What do you make of his game on the field? What makes him special as a player, so to speak?
Well, if he turns out to be anything like Raul Jimenez, then Wolves are onto a winner, because Jimenez does everything well. He's got no glaring weaknesses. And of course, Silva will have elements of his game to work on. He's only 18. He's got so many years ahead of him. But from what you can see on YouTube, and on our be careful with YouTube, because it can make anybody look like a world beater, but there looks to be some kind of promising signs and some parallels you could draw between the two. Looks very kind of comfortable with the ball at his feet, likes to kind of dribble with the ball, perhaps not the quickest across the ground, but has got enough pace to beat a man. And I'm just excited to see him play. Wolves play Stoke in the Carabao Cup, and that seems like a good opportunity to see some of him, hopefully from the start, if not as a substitute. But I think fans are just excited to see what he's going to bring to the team. Of course, they can't be in the grounds to see it yet, but if he turns out to be anything like Raul Jimenez, then he's going to be a special player.
How much do you expect him to play this season? It's not often that people sign someone for £35 million and you expect them to be on the bench for the majority of the season.
No, it is quite unique in that respect. Jimenez, as I say, is the main man, and Wolves aren't short of attacking options. They've got Adama Traore, of course, who had an outstanding season last season. Pedro Neto and Daniel Podence played in support of Jimenez at Sheffield United and played very well. Diogo Jota's there as well, and has just opened his account for Portugal. So Silva has competition, make no mistake. And perhaps if Wolves had been in the Europa League again this season, then maybe Silva would see more minutes. But I'd imagine he'd make somewhere between 5 and 10 starts, something like that. Perhaps he's going to be more of a player off the bench, I think. I think we've got to be careful not to expect too much too soon from him, because, as we say, he's 18. He's not played a lot of senior football at all. He's more of a signing for the long term. But equally, if he hits the ground running and scores a couple of goals and kind of gets in the groove, then fantastic. But for now, Jimenez has kicked off the season with a goal. It's his place to lose. And as long as he carries on the way he's going, then Jimenez is going to remain the main man, because he's got that track record.
In the game against Sheffield, we saw at the end of the game Vitinha get an appearance late on. What do you expect out of him this season? What type of player is he?
Well, again, they're not seeing a great deal of him. Again, a young player, but Wolves and Wolves fans, I think we're all kind of unanimous in that they wanted to see a creative midfielder come in and just add a bit of a different dynamic. And hopefully Vitinha will do that. It's a relatively risk-free deal for Wolves, because it's a loan for the season. They then have an option to buy him for £18 million at the end of it. So if he's a good player and he does well, then they bring him in on a permanent basis. And equally, if he's not up to it, if the league doesn't suit him, if he doesn't adjust right, then he goes back to Porto. So it seems a good deal.
We've already kind of talked about how Mendes is a real asset for Wolves, but yet interestingly, Wolves only really have 20 players or so that are expected to get regular minutes this season. And last season, one of the chief complaints, some people had was that, they didn't have the depth and that the squad was a little bit thin. How do you kind of weigh those two things where they have, one of the world's foremost agents kind of on their side, and then at the same time, maybe their squad's a little thin?
Well, the decision to have a small squad is purely down to Nuno, the manager. It's his approach. He doesn't like players just making up numbers in squads. He likes to give opportunities to young players. Feels that having young players who have kind of see a pathway to the first team is more productive than just having players brought in just as backups. He wants 16, 17 senior players who feel that they're in with a genuine chance of starting a game pretty much most weeks. And especially now that Wolves don't have the Europa League this season, it seems a sensible approach. I think there were times last season where they did look light. And perhaps the biggest thing now was that even though they only had 16, 17 players, it was the quality within that. But having signed Vitinha, Silva, and Marcel more so the ready-made player to come in and make an impact, you look at that 16, 17 man group now, and you have to say that it looks stronger. And that's the difference, really. It's about having 16, 17 players who can make a difference and come on and influence a game. Yeah, they haven't quite got the depth of other teams, but it's out of choice. And, if they wanted to have a 20, 25-man squad, then I'm sure, Wolves are now a club on the up. They've finished 7th back-to-back in the Premier League. They've got to the FA Cup semi-finals, Europa League quarter-finals. If they wanted to attract 20, 25 players, I'd imagine they'd do it comfortably. But it's about having a small, tight-knit group, players that feel that they're going to play most weeks. And it's an approach that works, really.
How much do you think that these signings are going to elevate this team? We know that they competed for the Champions League last year. Do you think that they'll compete for the Champions League this season with these new signings?
It's going to be harder to compete for the Champions League. You look at how much other teams have strengthened as well. I mean, Wolves have strengthened. They're not done yet, but they have strengthened. But you look at Everton, James Rodriguez going there. I mean, that's a very big name signing. And I mean, even the teams within the top six, I mean, Chelsea have just spent ridiculous money. So it will take a big effort, but I think there's a chance that we could be seeing a bit of an evolution from Wolves, really, in their style of play. At Sheffield United, it was very, very fluid, especially in attack. I mean, Nuno is so based on shape and sticking to the shape and being robust. But going forward, it seemed like, especially Pedro Neto and Daniel Podence playing with Raul Jimenez, had the license to kind of come deep, go wide, support the striker, play almost as a front two at times. So I think being a bit more adventurous and trying to kind of grab games by the scruff of the neck early on is something that they're going to do. And if they carry on scoring 2 goals within the first 6 minutes, as they did at Sheffield United, they could be onto something. So fingers crossed they can finish high again.
Are you a fan of football today? Then why not support the show and sign up to our new Patreon page? You'll get access to bonus episodes, full interviews, and extra content. Just go on Patreon and search Football Today. Now, back to the episode. While Wolves is an obvious success story, they're just one small part of the Jorge Mendes, Gestafute, Fosun network. Dr. Paul Widdop is an associate professor of sport at Manchester Metropolitan University and is the chair of the Football Collective. He's been studying football networks for years.
Networks are fundamental to sports business, and especially in football business. At the cornerstone of all decisions that are made, both internal and external decisions, and they're fundamental to the running of a football club. If you think about the transfer network, the academy, and who they're dealing with on a daily basis, the agents, the media. It's all part of a huge football world, which is a structure of a network. And we should start to think of the football world as a network rather than a series of separate entities.
You know, just how extensive is the Fosun Jorge Mendes Just a Few Day network?
Oh, it's a huge network it's got global entities. It crosses many, many fields from football to Hollywood movies. It connects China with Brazil, with America. The network is huge and expansive, and it's growing all the time. And football was the basis of the network growing, but now it's through different types of relationships. It's growing globally really quickly.
So you're saying it's far bigger than a football operation at this point?
Oh, if you just take the football network as an example, that in itself is big enough. I mean, that in itself will give you, if you take the top 5 leagues, for example, and start drawing a network, which we've done many times, you start seeing, there's a lot of connections between the clubs that Jorge Mendes has many connections with. And you start seeing, well, if you start building the network, you can start to see who the brokers of the network are, who is the important clubs that act as gateways to other clubs, for example, what we call network brokers, who are the middlemen, as to say that. And then you start building up beyond football, and then you start looking at links to Chinese organizations, Chinese governments, and you start looking at major talent agencies in the US. And you start to see that it's a global entertainment network.
So how does one of these types of networks operate? If we could maybe use the Just a Few Day example here, you know, how does it operate?
Well, if you see the Just a Few Day network, the way we would typically build a network is we're interested in what flows between the two nodes in the network, or nodes could be organizations, but in this case, we say football clubs. So there's an economic transfer between Club A and Club B, and we can track that. And when you start building that network up, you start to see patterns emerging, you start to see trends emerging, you start to see network processes happening. And what that means is that we can start uncovering the structure of the network, and the structure of the network always has consequences. So we can start to see where money's flowing, start to see where value is extracted from the network, and we start to see who the major players actually are.
Can you give a specific example, maybe with a player, of, you know, how that network affects a player? You know, because we're in the transfer season right now, and earlier in the episode talked about, you know, some players from Porto like Fabio Silva who are going to Wolves. Can you give an example of how a player gets funneled through a network?
Yeah, sure. I mean, a perfect example is loosely connected to Mendes, but not completely connected, is Fabiano for Liverpool.
It's going to come to Fabinho with the strike. Oh, my word! Fabinho! Fabulous!
I mean, you look at his career, you only have to look on Wikipedia at his career and how he's migrated to different clubs along the way without actually playing that many games. And then you start looking deeper into it, and you're seeing a lot of players moving around this network who they're just moving along to different clubs, and there's money changing hands and money's being extracted. And you start to see, well, actually, there's money in moving players around. Every time a player moves from point A to point B, there's money lost from the network, not lost from the football world, and there's money to be made. You start looking deeper at these networks, and you can start to see patterns emerging, and you can start to see which clubs receive which players and where did they go, for example. That's an interesting question to answer.
And so you're talking about kind of extracting value. Who extracts what value from a transfer and from the network effects? You know, can we talk a little bit about how the parties involved benefit from the network, if we can look at it from the point of view of Mendes or of the different clubs or the player involved?
Yeah, I mean, if you think about it really, in reality, if you're a manager of Club A and you need a centre forward, and you know manager of Club B has got a centre forward that you would like, and you also know that there is someone who sits in the middle, any football agent, who might make the deal happen, and you trust that person, and that person, you built up a long-lasting relationship with that person, so you know you like dealing with that person, then you would go to them rather than anyone else, and that's kind of like the relationships that are built up. It's almost like you're building up, we call it social capital. You're building up a lot of trust in the network, and you trust people to deliver you what you need, and then you trust them to sell them on. We live in a situation where classic economic theory would tell you that we're all utility maximization. We need a centre forward, just buy the best one we can. It doesn't really work like that. You have to take account of the relationships and who the agent involved are, even your relationship with the other football club.
So if we look at the example of Fosun and Wolves and Mendes, what are the benefits that Wolves and Mendes are getting out of that, and Fosun?
If you take Fosun, for example, they came into a market they relatively know little about. I mean, football isn't really one of their core business, what they do. So when they came into the English football market, there's a lot of organisations make the mistake of trying doing things on their own, but by embedding yourself in a network with one of the key network players in the industry, all of a sudden you've got access to a stable of players around Europe, and you've also got that access to that football knowledge straight away. So that's one of the reasons, why Fosun chose Mendes. He's the king of the network. He understands the football world better than anybody else.
Back in 2015, Fosun bought 15% of Gestafoot, Mendes' company, and when they did so, it seems to me like they almost made a third-party ownership kind of club. Interestingly, it was the same year that FIFA banned third-party ownership more generally. What do you make of them having direct investment in Mendes?
I don't know the inner workings of Wolves, but you'd have to question the relationship, and I'm sure that the authorities have looked into it and are quite happy with it, so we'll have to be. But for me, there's a little bit of vertical integration between an agent into the recruitment processes of a football club, which it's not an ideal situation if an agent controls the recruitment of a football club, simply because it's not a healthy situation. But I mean, of course, there's no secret that Fosun own a percentage in Gestafoot, and they also own Wolverhampton Wanderers, and the transfers that happen between Mendes' clients and Wolves is there for all to see. It's in black and white.
Are there any negatives of having this sort of network and close affiliation between clubs and, powerful super agents?
Yeah, I mean, where it is interesting is if you're not in the network. What happens if you're a club that doesn't sit in the network? Do you not have access to a whole host of players that you could afford, but simply you can't get them because you don't have the relationship with that's needed to make that deal happen? I think that's an important issue. There's also power issues within that. Who has power ultimately? That's always going to be an issue. I mean, not only horizontal power, but I mean vertical power.
Can you explain what you mean by vertical power?
Yeah, I mean, what I mean by vertical power is if power comes from a higher authority when they can make you do certain things. I'm not saying for 1 minute that Mendes or any agent shifts players to clubs simply because they want them to have them. But if there's an imbalance of power there, say if there's two football clubs that want to trade for a player and someone sits in the middle, that person who sits in the middle can control all the information that flows between the two clubs. So, I mean, if he controls information such as how the cost of the person, giving one cost to one cost to another, he's controlling the information. So he has power in that relationship. And if that power is used as a means of almost like keeping the other clubs in the dark to generate more money, then, it can become problematic.
So do you see this practice of a club strongly aligning itself with an agent increasing in the future? It seems to be a little bit on the rise.
I see it increasing, but I don't think it's a great thing. Because if you think about in economic theory, that they go on about having access to all the information, being utility maximizers, so they're independent of any decisions. It's done basically on selfishness. So they understand what they're doing. But actually they're not. They're using an agent who can muddy the waters. They don't have access to other players in other parts of the world. They only have access to a certain stock of player. So you start to see when you start to look at the network in a bigger picture, you start to see these patterns, the well-trodden paths of of footballers who move from club to club to club, and you start seeing the same patterns happening between the clubs. And it gets to a point where you think, well, you only have to look at the structure of the network and you start seeing patterns emerging of where people are going. And it's almost to the point where you can predict where they'll end up. Say if a player comes out of a certain club in Portugal, you can predict where they'll end up in 2 moves' time, for example.
Would you say that this is good for the sport or not?
Not particularly, no, because super agents will get bigger and bigger and start to corner the market and start to monopolise the market, really. And then, if a football player, for example, wants to move, he has to work with a certain agent. And say if a Club A wants to play from Club B, then they'll have to buy a player from Club C before they can talk about the player from Club B. So it's all, you get in a position where it becomes almost like game theory, where you're playing a game of risk and a game of chance, and you don't know what's going to happen. And I believe in an open market, which I don't believe it's free at the moment. I think it's agents simply carve up the market. You're not free to choose whoever you want to do.
Do you see that changing anytime soon?
No, not unless there's regulation. As in all capitalist markets, if you're free to with no regulation, we've seen that markets aren't very good regulators of themselves. So unless there's some strict regulation, then I don't believe that it'll be a healthy situation for the transfer network.
Joe Edwards covers Wolves for the Express and Star and is a co-host of the E&amp Wolves podcast. Dr. Paul Widdop is an associate professor of sport at Manchester Metropolitan University and is the chair of the Football Collective. The music for this episode was provided under the Creative Commons license by Blue Dot Sessions, and you can find more information about the music tracks in our episode description. This episode was co-produced by John McKenzie. I'm Josh Schneider-Weiler, and thanks for listening to Football Today. And before you go, if you're a fan of the show and would like to support us, please sign up to our Patreon page where you'll get access to bonus episodes and extra content. And if you can't spare the cash, please tell a friend instead. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.